You think the person next door knows you until you realize they're watching everything you do. They thought they were starting life. 3 different people, 3 different neighborhoods, 3 mornings that felt ordinary until the ordinary bent into something else. Tonight, you'll hear 3 true neighbor horror stories that crawl from quiet surveillance into full-blown menace, and one that ends with no clear answer at all. These are first-person accounts. Some details have been changed for safety, but the fear they felt is theirs. Mike's story begins like so many American starts to home ownership. Boxes, spreadsheets, a couch that takes 2 people and a prayer to get through the front door. He and his fiancée signed on to a modest house in a quiet Georgia suburb. The street had wide oaks, mailboxes with brass flags, and front porches where people waved and put out seasonal wreaths. Neighbors were friendly in the way neighbors often are: nods, borrowed sugar, a smile over a fence. At first, nothing seemed wrong. You know the way a new place feels like it wants to be loved? Paint chips, the squeak in the upstairs floor, the sense that you're the first to put your life into that square footage. They spent the first week painting walls, hanging pictures, putting together a bed frame that took more Allen keys than the instructions suggested. At night, they slept under a pile of unpacked boxes, the hum of the air conditioner the only constant. Then Mike noticed the curtains. They were closed on the house next door. Every single time he walked by the living room window during the day, the curtains were drawn tight or just partly closed. Sometimes, if the sun hit right, he could see a shadowed figure move behind the fabric. It was subtle. He chalked it up to privacy. People keep to themselves, he told himself. But the shadow seemed to be in the same place, watching the same slice of yard. It unnerved him the way a pair of eyes gleam across a street at night and you feel watched without seeing a face. At first, it was glances, the old man across the way behind a curtain, the occasional silhouette. Mike tried to be rational. Maybe the man worked night shifts and slept during the day. Maybe he had health issues. Maybe any number of reasons that never felt satisfying. Then things shifted into concrete trespass. One evening, Mike came home late from a double shift. The front porch light was on. As he opened his gate, he saw footprints in the damp grass, shoe prints that led up the side of his house where there was no walkway. They trailed toward the back and then came again toward the front, stopping just shy of his living room window. He felt his skin go cold. He checked the locks, watched the empty street, and found a scrap of fabric snagged on his fence, like someone had brushed by while peering in. When he told his fiancée, she laughed nervously and said, "Maybe a kid from down the block." But the neighborhood's kids were teenagers who rode skateboards and crashed into mailboxes. Their shoes didn't match the prints. They started putting motion-activated lights on the porch and cameras by the doors, not yet believing they were being watched, but wanting to know if they were. The first confrontation came on a Tuesday that seemed like any other. The man next door, Gordon, walked out with a paper bag and a grin and called across, "Hey, new folks, welcome." He was older, in his 60s, tidy shirt, thinning hair. He introduced himself slowly, like someone plucking the right names from memory. He was polite enough. He brought over store-bought cookies and offered small talk about the weather and the condition of oaks in Georgia. They accepted the cookies to be neighborly, but after he left, they found an old rusted nail in the bag, bent, blunt, like someone had used it to pry and then tossed it away. It was the kind of small, odd thing that didn't make sense. Gordon's smile didn't either. It had a firmness at the edges that felt like an admission of distance. After that, he began to appear in the yard at odd hours. He claimed he was chasing kids off his property or collecting neighborhood litter, but he was often there late at night, lingering by the shrubbery, watching windows. He told them stories about how he remembered the block years ago and slipped in remarks that stung. Not direct insults, but comments about how people like you don't usually settle here. Until finally, one night at a dinner invitation, the words were no longer veiled. They were invited over for spaghetti one Saturday. Mike's fiancée hesitated. The offer felt staged, like a move in a game they hadn't agreed to join. They went anyway. Early in the evening, the conversation was what it pretended to be. Recipes, who to ask for paint advice, which local store had the best pie. Then the tone shifted. It tightened like the coil of a spring. Gordon started to talk about the neighborhood changing. He told a story about property values and people moving in. And then, softer but sharper, about who belongs and who doesn't. Mike remembers the way his fiancée's jaw tightened. When they tried to steer back to safer subjects, Gordon leaned forward and said plainly, "You know, I've seen you out there. You don't exactly look like the others around here." Not a question, a statement with the weight of accusation. Mike felt heat in his cheeks and the room tilt. The cookies on the table tasted suddenly stale. Gordon admitted, without prompting, that he had been looking out for the block, and too often his version of looking meant standing at his window watching them. He laughed at a joke that wasn't funny, and then said they should know their place. His gaze went to the window next to the couch, and he almost smiled. It was the first moment they felt the clarity. This wasn't someone eccentric and lonely. This was someone studying them, measuring them against an idea of who belonged. They left that night with tight throats and a tightness in their limbs. It should have felt like a friendship gone wrong. Instead, it felt like an inspection. Mike thought, leave, move. But moving costs money, jobs, grief at leaving a house you already loved. They tried to get the police to take a report when the brick came through their living room window, but that was the thing that crystallized fear into action. It was late. He was up working. She had gone to bed earlier. There was a sudden, shattering sound, not the slow crack of a tree branch or the polite thump of something hitting siding, but the high, animal noise of glass giving way under force. He ran into the living room, and there, on the hardwood, lay a brick. No note, just red clay and a smear on the sill where the edge had torn the curtain. The camera on the porch recorded nothing, a gap of static for a few seconds, then footage resumed of an empty street. The police came, took statements, dusted for prints. They filed an incident report. The officers were courteous but honest in a way that would make every later bolt in the night heavier. Without direct evidence, a neighbor can be impossible to prosecute. They could document, they could advise, they could not prove who had thrown the brick. After that, the house ceased to be theirs in the way that truly matters. Every creak in the floorboard at night sounded like an announcement. Every passerby on the sidewalk was Gordon in another coat. The couple sold the home within 2 months and moved away. They felt relief and a complicated grief. Relief that they were out, grief that their place of safety had been compromised. They still flinch at late-night wind and find themselves checking locks twice. They carry a memory like an old bruise, the way a man can look at the person he wants to exclude and make them feel not merely unwelcome, but vulnerable. If that unsettles you, hit like and tell us in the comments, would you have stayed? There are many small horrors that start with looking. Now meet Noah's story, which starts with a neighborly slice of normalcy and becomes something else entirely darker. Noah and his then-fiancée moved into what he called a comfortable house, a place with a mailbox that snagged the mail just right, a driveway wide enough to park the car, and a backyard that held a grill. Their neighbors, Daniel and Veronica, seemed like the kind of people who invited you in with a cake. For months, Noah would borrow a cup of sugar, and their conversations centered around polite things, landscaping tips, loud air conditioners, who to call about a humming furnace. They brought a red velvet cake to his birthday once, and that cake became the image he clung to when the world folded inward, a bright, innocent thing in a scene that would later turn bloody. The trouble began with arguments. Not the kind you hear and forget at 3 a.m, but sustained shouting matches that skittered across the thin line between the privacy of walls and the public space that neighbors share. Voices would rise and then fall into a heavy metallic silence. At first, he says, he tried to rationalize. Couples argue. Houses are living organisms made of opinions and tempers. Then Veronica stopped answering. Noah's neighborly checks, a wave across the driveway, a knock on the door, began to be met by Daniel's practiced politeness. "She's at work," he would say. When Noah's fiancée asked if that seemed odd, Daniel waved it off with a laugh. But there was a muffled sound one night, a choking, animal noise at 3 in the morning that stopped the world cold. Noah pressed his ear to the wall. It was easy to imagine it as the distant television, until the sound became a gasp, then a harder, suppressed pleading. He felt a human responsibility rise in his throat. He went over. He asked Daniel if everything was okay. Daniel smiled in that way people do when they've rehearsed an answer and told a lie to themselves often enough that it becomes tidy. "We're fine," he said. "My wife and I had a fight." That should have been the end of it, except that people who are fine in the way Daniel said fine also make bad choices in their private spaces when no one is watching. One night, Noah heard a shriek that was real and immediate enough to drag him from sleep. His living room light flipped on, and there was a moment of sharp clarity. Something was very wrong. A welfare check was called. Someone finally did what felt impossible for him to carry alone. They called authorities. Police, then paramedics, then the kind of siren chorus that makes a block feel like a scene in a film. The officers forced entry. What they found was a scene of prolonged abuse and cruelty. Veronica was taken to an ambulance and later died of multiple stab wounds. Daniel was arrested shortly thereafter. When Noah spoke to officers, he felt relief wrapped in terror. Relief that action had been taken, terror at the scale of what it unveiled. The community's astonishment turned to sorrow and then a hard-eyed anger that did not show itself in fireworks but in whispered conversations on porches. Daniel, in the moments before custody, fixated on Noah. He told him, through the dim rectangle of a holding cell window, "You'll regret this." It was a line delivered with intent, a promise cloaked as menace. Noah lives with that sentence like a nightlight that keeps turning on in the dark. It pulses and refuses to be outrun. What lingers for him is not just the image of an ambulance leaving the driveway or the subsequent court dates. It's the memory of how ordinary things carried terrible weight. A neighborly cake, a door left unanswered, a muffled sound in the night. It's the knowledge that domestic violence often happens behind walls in places that look like everyone else's life. People in the community who had waved and borrowed sugar later mourned and asked themselves how much they had missed, how much denial had been a polite neighbor to cruelty. Noah's nightmares weren't cinematic, they were precise. Daniel in the margin of his vision, returning from prison like a bad thought made flesh. He moved his wife and himself after it all, looking for distance. But distance doesn't always sever the sense of being seen by a man who made a promise. The community tightened, not in unity, but in the hard silence of people who have learned to look twice at the windows across the way. This next account is different from the first two. No brick, no confession, no clear perpetrator. It's a terror of ambiguity, the kind that wakes you and asks whether the most frightening presence is human at all. Devin was 24 and living in a Queens duplex. He worked odd shifts and relied on the thin, affordable housing the city provided. The walls were paper thin, an architecture of complaint. You could hear frying pans clatter, hear neighbors laugh loud enough to keep you awake. At first, it was the usual noises of communal life. He told himself he'd learned to sleep through someone else's rhythm. Then he started hearing a different pattern. It began with talking, not television voices, but the sound of someone in proximity muttering under their breath. High-pitched syllables, almost like words shaped but swallowed in the wall. On some nights, the talking climbed, a tide of small voices that had no identifiable source. He thought at first that it was someone pacing, an old radio, or a neighbor practicing lines quietly into the night. The knocks started a few weeks later. At first, a casual rap on the wall, 3 light taps, the kind of signal neighbors sometimes use to indicate a need with an adjacent unit. Devin knocked back once, unsure. Silence.
The next night, the knocks were deliberate and close, not on the shared wall, but directly against the headboard side where he slept. They came at odd times, once at 3 in the morning, like an insistence. One late-night knock was sharp and immediate enough to wake him. He lay there, heart trying to find the pace of his breath. "Who's there?" he whispered. No answer, only a soft rippling of something on the other side of the wall. He texted his boyfriend, who lived an hour away, and begged him to come over. The boyfriend came and stayed the night on the couch. 2 people in a small apartment are louder in presence than in sound, and Devin felt safer with someone awake. Then came the moment that changes ordinary fear into something that claws memory. He had fallen into a deep sleep, the kind that leaves you unmoored. In the middle of the night, he was dragged up into consciousness by the most aggressive knocking he'd heard yet. It was not a polite pattern. It was a barrage against the barrier of his life. He lurched upright in bed, naked and disoriented, and shouted for his boyfriend.
A voice answered, not from the hallway, not a neighbor calling through the door, but from within the room. It was low and final and made his teeth feel loose with dread. Go to sleep. Devin says he doesn't remember making any coherent choice before he was out in the street, standing under a sodium streetlight in nothing but the skin on his back. He called the police. Officers came, searched, and found no evidence of tampering. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the cold patch of dirt outside the window. The neighbor in the duplex was unreachable. When officers knocked on that door, there was no answer. Months later, Devin would learn the neighbor moved out quietly, like someone who wants to disappear without acknowledgement. He broke his lease. He moved back in with his family. He sleeps with lights on. He sometimes wakes to the sound of his own apartment creak and wonders if that low voice is a human who knew them, a trespasser who slipped in and left no mark, or something else entirely. The possibility that it might be supernatural is not what terrifies him most. Uncertainty does. The idea that the world sometimes doesn't give you a reason is more corrosive than any answer that could be provided. If someone is there, you want to know they're accountable. If there's nothing to point to, you're left with your sense that your home was invaded and nothing else. Across these 3 accounts, some themes crystallize. The privacy of home violated, the thinness of walls between safety and surveillance, and the fact that people who smile over the fence may harbor darker things. Mike was watched and then driven out by intimidation. Noah watched domestic terror erupt into fatal violence, and his life was haunted thereafter by a neighbor's threat. Devin woke into a night that offered no proof and an unresolved chill that follows him into quiet rooms. What unites them is simple and terrifying. Neighbors are close enough to harm. They are people whose routines align with yours, whose silhouette at the curtains is ordinary until it is not. Most of us assume that the worst thing at the edge of our property is a stray cat or a late-night jogger. These stories remind us how easily that assumption can be wrong. If you find yourself remembering these images and feeling the hairs on the back of your neck, you are not alone. Practical steps matter, even as we acknowledge the emotional cost. Document what you can, keep records of incidents, and involve authorities when you feel threatened. Install lights, safety cameras, or simply create a line of visibility between your house and the street. If you are in immediate danger or witness a crime, call local law enforcement. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, reach out to local resources or hotlines. You do not have to carry that burden alone.
None of these are guarantees. The world offers no promises, but they are options people have used to create space between themselves and harm. There's another cost these stories show. Leaving a house isn't simply a logistical move. It can feel like losing a piece of identity. Mike lost the place where he imagined starting a family. Noah lost the illusion that polite neighbors are safe neighbors. Devon lost the capacity to sleep without a light on. Those losses are not trivial. They are the quiet aftershocks that shape who people become. And yet, while practicalities are important, the scariest element is the ordinary face of it. We want to believe that someone who brings cookies is a friend. We want to believe that yelling is just a bad night. We want to believe that a knock at the wall is someone needing sugar or borrowing an egg. Those small beliefs are how communities form. But sometimes the ordinary masks something else, and it is that masking that makes these stories linger. As you turn off this video and walk to your own front door tonight, you might look at the house across the street differently. You might imagine the curtains parted and a shadow that has always been there. That image is not meant to feed paranoia. It is meant to sharpen awareness. There is courage in noticing. There is bravery in documenting. There is protection in speaking up and in not minimizing what our instincts tell us. One more thing. If you are currently living with threats or the kind of creeping dread you heard in these stories, call your local authorities. Consider seeking help from domestic violence resources and reach out to friends or family you trust. Safety planning with professionals can give you options that feel impossible alone. If you're unsure where to start, a local hotline or community shelter directory can connect you to resources in confidence. These houses, these neighbors, left 3 lives changed in different, enduring ways. Some of the harm was visible: a broken window, an arrest, an ambulance. Some of it was invisible: nights of insomnia, persistent fear, the way a person starts to plan for exits instead of tea parties. The scariest part is not only that danger can live next door, but that the shape it takes can be so ordinary you almost miss it until it's too close to step away from. If these stories have unsettled you and you want to hear more accounts like them, subscribe for more true neighbor horror stories. Share this with someone who needs to know that the familiar can sometimes be frightening, and remind them that if they are in danger, help is available. They moved into seemingly normal houses. They painted walls and planted small trees. They ate cake on sunny afternoons and said goodbye to houses they had hoped would be home. The thing that will likely stay with you is not the brick, the prison, or the creature that might have spoken through the wall.
It's the image of a window opened to a face you don't know, and the understanding that home is sometimes just thin walls and a fragile, human hope that the person on the other side is safe. If you or someone you know needs immediate help with domestic violence or is in danger, please contact local emergency services. For confidential support, consider reaching out to a domestic violence hotline in your country. You do not have to handle this alone. Sleep well if you can. But if you hear a knock in the night, answer it with caution. The person next door might be a neighbor, or they might be a story you can never quite live down.